Chapter 1 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 1. "Nell, I'm growing powerful fond of you." "So you must be, Master Joe, if often telling makes it true." The girl spoke simply, and with an absence of that roguishness which was characteristic of her. Playful words, arch smiles, and a touch of coquetry had seemed natural to Nell, but now her grave tone and her almost wistful glance disconcerted Joe. During all the long journey over the mountains she had been gay and bright, while now, when they were about to part, perhaps never to meet again, she showed him the deeper and more earnest side of her character. It checked his boldness as nothing else had done. Suddenly there came to him the real meaning of a woman's love when she bestows it without reservation. Silenced by the thought that he had not understood her at all, and the knowledge that he had been half in sport, he gazed out over the wild country before them. The scene impressed its quietness upon the young couple, and brought more forcibly to their minds the fact that they were at the gateway of the unknown West, that somewhere beyond this rude frontier settlement, out there in those unbroken forests stretching dark and silent before them, was to be their future home. From the high bank where they stood the land sloped and narrowed gradually until it ended in a sharp point which marked the last bit of land between the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Here these swift streams merged and formed the broad Ohio. The new-born river, even here at its beginning, proud and swelling as if already certain of its far-away grandeur, swept majestically round a wide curve, and apparently lost itself in the forest foliage. On the narrow point of land commanding a view of the rivers stood a long, low structure, enclosed by a stockade fence, on the four corners of which were little box-shaped houses that bulged out as if trying to see what was going on beneath. The massive timbers used in the construction of this fort, the square, compact form, and the small dark holes cut into the walls gave the structure a threatening, impregnable aspect. Below Nell and Joe, on the bank, were many log cabins. The yellow clay which filled the chinks between the logs gave these a peculiar striped appearance. There was life and bustle in the vicinity of these dwellings, in sharp contrast with the still grandeur of the neighboring forests. There were canvas-covered wagons around which curly-headed youngsters were playing. Several horses were grazing on the short grass, and 6 red and white oxen munched at the hay that had been thrown to them. The smoke of many fires curled upward, and near the blaze hovered ruddy-faced women who stirred the contents of steaming kettles. One man swung an axe with a vigorous sweep, and the clean, sharp strokes rang on the air. Another hammered stakes into the ground on which to hang a kettle. Before a large cabin, a fur trader was exhibiting his wares to 3 Indians. A second redskin was carrying a pack of pelts from a canoe drawn up on the river bank. A small group of persons stood near. Some were indifferent, and others gazed curiously at the savages. 2 children peeped from behind their mothers' skirts, as if half curious, half frightened. From this scene, the significance of which had just dawned on him, Joe turned his eyes again to his companion. It was a sweet face he saw, one that was sedate, but had a promise of innumerable smiles. The blue eyes could not long hide flashes of merriment. The girl turned, and the 2 young people looked at each other. Her eyes softened with a woman's gentleness as they rested upon him, for, broad of shoulder and lithe and strong as a deerstalker, he was good to look at. "Listen," she said, "we have known each other only 3 weeks. Since you joined our wagon train and have been so kind to me and so helpful to make that long, rough ride endurable, you have won my regard. I cannot say more, even if I would." You told me you ran away from your Virginian home to seek adventure on the frontier, and that you knew no one in all this wild country. You even said you could not, or would not, work at farming. Perhaps my sister and I are as unfitted as you for this life, but we must cling to our uncle because he is the only relative we have. He has come out here to join the Moravians and to preach the gospel to these Indians. We shall share his life and help him all we can. You have been telling me you cared for me, and now that we are about to part, I don't know what to say to you, unless it is, give up this intention of yours to seek adventure, and come with us. It seems to me you need not hunt for excitement here. It will come unsought." "I wish I were Jim," he said suddenly. "Who is Jim?" "My brother." "Tell me of him." "There's nothing much to tell. He and I are all that are left of our people, as are you and Kate of yours. Jim's a preacher, and the best fellow. Oh, I cared a lot for Jim." "Then why did you leave him?" "I was tired of Williamsburg. I quarreled with the fellow and hurt him. Besides, I wanted to see the West. I'd like to hunt deer and bear and fight Indians. Oh, I'm not much good." "Was Jim the only one you cared for?" asked Nell, smiling. She was surprised to find him grave. "Yes, except my horse and dog, and I had to leave them behind," answered Joe, bowing his head a little. "You'd like to be Jim because he's a preacher and could help Uncle convert the Indians?" "Well, yes, partly that, but mostly because somehow something you've said or done has made me care for you in a different way, and I'd like to be worthy of you." "I don't think I can believe it when you say you are no good," she replied. "Nell!" he cried, and suddenly grasped her hand. She wrenched herself free and leaped away from him. Her face was bright now, and the promise of smiles was made good. "Behave yourself, sir." She tossed her head with a familiar backward motion to throw the chestnut hair from her face, and looked at him with eyes veiled slightly under their lashes. "You will go with Kate and me?" Before he could answer, a cry from someone on the plain below attracted their attention. They turned and saw another wagon train pulling into the settlement. The children were shouting and running alongside the weary oxen. Men and women went forward expectantly. "That must be the train Uncle expected. Let us go down," said Nell. Joe did not answer, but followed her down the path. When they gained a clump of willows near the cabins, he bent forward and took her hand. She saw the reckless gleam in his eyes. "Don't! They'll see," she whispered. "If that's the only reason you have, I reckon I don't care," said Joe. "What do you mean? I didn't tell Oh, let me go," implored Nell. She tried to release the hand Joe had grasped in his broad palm, but in vain. The more she struggled, the firmer was his hold. A frown wrinkled her brow, and her eyes sparkled with spirit. She saw the fur trader's wife looking out of the window, and remembered laughing and telling the good woman she did not like this young man. It was perhaps because she feared those sharp eyes that she resented his audacity. She opened her mouth to rebuke him, but no words came. Joe had bent his head and softly closed her lips with his own. For the single instant during which Nell stood transfixed, as if with surprise, and looking up at Joe, she was dumb. Usually the girl was ready with sharp or saucy words, and impulsive in her movements. But now the bewilderment of being kissed, particularly within view of the trader's wife, confused her. Then she heard voices, and as Joe turned away with a smile on his face, the unusual warmth in her heart was followed by an angry throbbing. Joe's tall figure stood out distinctly as he leisurely strolled toward the incoming wagon train without looking backward. Flashing after him a glance that boded wordy trouble in the future, she ran into the cabin. As she entered the door, it seemed certain the grizzled frontiersman sitting on the bench outside had grinned knowingly at her, and winked as if to say he would keep her secret. Mrs. Wentz, the fur trader's wife, was seated by the open window which faced the fort. She was a large woman, strong of feature, and with that calm placidity of expression common to people who have lived long in sparsely populated districts. Nell glanced furtively at her, and thought she detected the shadow of a smile in the gray eyes. "I saw you and your sweetheart making love behind the willow," Mrs. Wentz said in a matter-of-fact voice. "I don't see why you need to hide to do it. We folks out here like to see the young people sparking. Your young man is a fine-appearing chap. I felt certain you was sweethearts, for all you allowed you'd known him only a few days. Lize Davis said she saw he was sweet on you. I like his face. Jake, my man, says as how he'll make a good husband for you, and he'll take to the frontier like a duck does to water. I'm sorry you'll not tarry here a while. We don't see many lasses, especially any as pretty as you, and you'll find it more quiet and lonesome the farther west you get. Jake knows all about Fort Henry, and Jeff Lynn, the hunter outside, he knows Eb and Jack Zane and Wetzel and all those Fort Henry men. You'll be getting married out there, won't you?" "You are quite wrong," said Nell, who all the while Mrs. Wentz was speaking grew rosier and rosier. "We're not anything—" Then Nell hesitated and finally ceased speaking. She saw that denials or explanations were futile. The simple woman had seen the kiss and formed her own conclusions. During the few days Nell had spent at Fort Pitt, she had come to understand that the dwellers on the frontier took everything as a matter of course. She had seen them manifest a certain pleasure, but neither surprise, concern, nor any of the quick impulses so common among other people. And this was another lesson Nell took to heart. She realized that she was entering upon a life absolutely different from her former one, and the thought caused her to shrink from the ordeal. Yet all the suggestions regarding her future home, the stories told about Indians, renegades, and of the wild border life, fascinated her. These people who had settled in this wild region were simple, honest, and brave. They accepted what came as facts not to be questioned, and believed what looked true. Evidently the fur trader's wife and her female neighbors had settled in their minds the relation in which the girl stood to Joe. This latter reflection heightened Nell's resentment toward her lover. She stood with her face turned away from Mrs. Wentz. The little frown deepened, and she nervously tapped her foot on the floor. "Where is my sister?" she presently asked. "She went to see the wagon train come in. Everybody's out there." Nell deliberated a moment, and then went into the open air. She saw a number of canvas-covered wagons drawn up in front of the cabins. The vehicles were dusty and the wheels encrusted with yellow mud. The grizzled frontiersman who had smiled at Nell stood leaning on his gun, talking to three men whose travel-stained and worn homespun clothes suggested a long and toilsome journey. There was the bustle of excitement incident to the arrival of strangers, to the quick exchange of greetings, the unloading of wagons, and unharnessing of horses and oxen. Nell looked here and there for her sister. Finally she saw her standing near her uncle while he conversed with one of the teamsters. The girl did not approach them, but glanced quickly around in search of someone else. At length she saw Joe unloading goods from one of the wagons. His back was turned toward her, but she at once recognized the challenge conveyed by the broad shoulders. She saw no other person, gave heed to nothing save what was to her righteous indignation. Hearing her footsteps, the young man turned, glancing at her admiringly, said, "Good evening, miss." Nell had not expected such a matter-of-fact greeting from Joe. There was not the slightest trace of repentance in his calm face, and he placidly continued his labor. "Aren't you sorry you treated me so?" burst out Nell. His coolness was exasperating. Instead of the contrition and apology she had expected, and which was her due, he evidently intended to tease her, as he had done so often. The young man dropped a blanket and stared. "I don't understand," he said gravely. "I never saw you before." This was too much for quick-tempered Nell. She had had some vague idea of forgiving him, after he had sued sufficiently for pardon, but now, forgetting her good intentions in the belief that he was making sport of her when he should have pleaded for forgiveness, she swiftly raised her hand and slapped him smartly. The red blood flamed to the young man's face. As he staggered backward with his hand to his cheek, she heard a smothered exclamation behind her, and then the quick, joyous barking of a dog. When Nell turned, she was amazed to see Joe standing beside the wagon, while a big white dog was leaping upon him. Suddenly she felt faint. Bewildered, she looked from Joe to the man she had just struck, but could not say which was the man who professed to love her. "Jem, so you followed me!" cried Joe, starting forward and flinging his arms around the other. "Yes, Joe, and right glad I am to find you," answered the young man, while a peculiar expression of pleasure came over his face. "It's good to see you again, and here's my old dog Mose. But how on earth did you know? Where did you strike my trail? What are you going to do out here on the frontier? Tell me all. What happened after I left?" Then Joe saw Nell standing nearby, pale and distressed, and he felt something was amiss. He glanced quickly from her to his brother. She seemed to be dazed, and Jim looked grave. "What the deuce? Nell, this is my brother Jim, the one I told you about. Jim, this is my friend, Miss Wells." "I am happy to meet Miss Wells," said Jim with a smile, "even though she did slap my face for nothing." "Slapped you? What for?" Then the truth dawned on Joe, and he laughed until the tears came into his eyes. "She took you for me! Ha, ha! Oh, this is great!" Nell's face was now rosy red, and moisture glistened in her eyes, but she tried bravely to stand her ground. Humiliation had taken the place of anger. I'm sorry, Mr. Downs. I did take you for him. He has insulted me." Then she turned and ran into the cabin. End of Chapter 1 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Joe and Jim were singularly alike. They were nearly the same size, very tall, but so heavily built as to appear of medium height, while their gray eyes, and indeed every feature of their clean-cut faces, corresponded so exactly as to proclaim them brothers. "Already up to your old tricks?" asked Jim, with his hand on Joe's shoulder, as they both watched Nell's flight. "I'm really fond of her, Jim, and I didn't mean to hurt her feelings. But tell me about yourself. What made you come west?" "To teach the Indians, and I was, no doubt, strongly influenced by your being here." "You're going to do as you ever have, make some sacrifice. You're always devoting yourself, if not to me, to some other. Now it's your life you're giving up. To try to convert the redskins and influence me for good is in both cases impossible. How often have I said there wasn't any good in me? My desire is to kill Indians, not preach to them, Jim. I'm glad to see you, but I wish you hadn't come. This wild frontier is no place for a preacher." "I think it is," said Jim quietly. "Well, what of Rose, the girl you were to marry?" Joe glanced quickly at his brother. Jim's face paled slightly as he turned away. "I'll speak once more of her, and then never again," he answered. "You knew Rose better than I did. Once you tried to tell me she was too fond of admiration, and I rebuked you. But now I see that your wider experience of women had taught you things I could not then understand. She was untrue. When you left Williamsburg, apparently because you had gambled with Jewett and afterward fought him, I was not misled. You made the game of cards a pretense. You sought it simply as an opportunity to wreak your vengeance on him for his villainy toward me. Well, it's all over now. Though you cruelly beat and left him disfigured for life, he will live, and you are saved from murder, thank God. When I learned of your departure, I yearned to follow. Then I met a preacher who spoke of having intended to go west with a Mr. Wells of the Moravian mission. I immediately said I would go in his place, and here I am. I'm fortunate in that I have found both him and you. I'm sorry I didn't kill Jewett. I certainly meant to. Anyway, there's some comfort in knowing I left my mark on him. He was a sneaking, cold-blooded fellow, with his white hair and pale face, and always fawning round the girls. I hated him and gave it to him good." Joe spoke musingly and complacently, as though it was a trivial thing to compass the killing of a man. "Well, Jim, you're here now, and there's no help for it. We'll go along with this Moravian preacher and his nieces. If you haven't any great regrets for the past, why, all may be well yet. I can see that the border is the place for me. But now, Jim, for once in your life, take a word of advice from me. We're out on the frontier, where every man looks after himself. Your being a minister won't protect you here, where every man wears a knife and a tomahawk, and where most of them are desperadoes. Cut out that soft voice and most of your gentle ways, and be a little more like your brother. Be as kind as you like, and preach all you want to. But when some of these buckskin-legged frontiersmen try to walk all over you, as they will, take your own part in a way you have never taken it before. I had my lesson the first few days out with the wagon train. It was a case of 4 fights, but I'm all right now." "Joe, I won't run, if that's what you mean," answered Jim, with a laugh. "Yes, I understand that a new life begins here, and I'm content. If I can find my work in it and remain with you, I shall be happy." "Ah, old Mose, I'm glad to see you," Joe cried to the big dog, who came nosing round him. "You've brought this old fellow. Did you bring the horses?" "Look behind the wagon." With the dog bounding before him, Jim did as he was directed, and there found 2 horses tethered side by side. Little wonder that his eyes gleamed with delight. One was jet black, the other iron gray, and in every line the clean-limbed animals showed the thoroughbred. The black threw up his slim head and whinnied, with affection clearly shining in his soft dark eyes as he recognized his master. "Lance, old fellow, how did I ever leave you?" murmured Joe, as he threw his arm over the arched neck. Mose stood by, looking up, and wagging his tail in token of happiness at the reunion of the 3 old friends. There were tears in Joe's eyes when, with a last affectionate caress, he turned away from his pet. "Come, Jim, I'll take you to Mr. Wells." They started across the little square, while Mose went back under the wagon, but at a word from Joe he bounded after them, trotting contentedly at their heels. Halfway to the cabins, a big, raw-boned teamster, singing in a drunken voice, came staggering toward them. Evidently he had just left the group of people who had gathered near the Indians. "I didn't expect to see drunkenness out here," said Jim in a low tone. "There's lots of it. I saw that fellow yesterday when he couldn't walk. Wentz told me he was a bad customer." The teamster, his red face bathed in perspiration, and his sleeves rolled up, showing brown, knotty arms, lurched toward them. As they met, he aimed a kick at the dog, but Mose leaped nimbly aside, avoiding the heavy boot. He did not growl or show his teeth, but the great white head sank forward a little, and the lithe body crouched for a spring. "Don't touch that dog. He'll tear your leg off," Joe cried sharply. "Say, pard, come and have a drink," replied the teamster with a friendly leer. "I don't drink," answered Joe curtly, and moved on. The teamster growled something, of which only the word "parson" was intelligible to the brothers. Joe stopped and looked back. His gray eyes seemed to contract. They did not flash, but shaded and lost their warmth. Jim saw the change, and knowing what it signified, took Joe's arm as he gently urged him away. The teamster's shrill voice could be heard until they entered the fur trader's cabin. An old man with long white hair flowing from beneath his wide-brimmed hat sat near the door, holding one of Mrs. Wentz's children on his knee. His face was deep-lined and serious, but kindness shone from his mild blue eyes. Mr. Wells, this is my brother James. He is a preacher, and has come in place of the man you expected from Williamsburg." The old minister arose and extended his hand, gazing earnestly at the newcomer meanwhile. Evidently he approved of what he saw in his quick scrutiny of the other's face, for his lips were wreathed with a smile of welcome. "Mr. Downs, I am glad to meet you, and to know you will go with me. I thank God I shall take into the wilderness one who is young enough to carry on the work when my days are done." "I will make it my duty to help you in whatsoever way lies in my power," answered Jim earnestly. "We have a great work before us. I have heard many scoffers who claim that it is worse than folly to try to teach these fierce savages Christianity, but I know it can be done, and my heart is in my work. I have no fear, yet I would not conceal from you, young man, that the danger of going among these hostile Indians must be great." "I will not hesitate because of that. My sympathy is with the red man. I have had an opportunity of studying Indian nature, and believe the race inherently noble. He has been driven to make war, and I want to help him into other paths." Joe left the two ministers talking earnestly and turned toward Mrs. Wentz. The fur trader's wife was glowing with pleasure. She held in her hand several rude trinkets, and was explaining to her listener, a young woman, that the toys were for the children, having been brought all the way from Williamsburg. "Kate, where's Nell?" Joe asked of the girl. "She went on an errand for Mrs. Wentz." Kate Wells was the opposite of her sister. Her motions were slow, easy, and consistent with her large, full form. Her brown eyes and hair contrasted sharply with Nell's. The greatest difference in the sisters lay in that Nell's face was sparkling and full of the fire of her eager young life, while Kate's was calm, like the unruffled surface of a deep lake. "That's Jim, my brother. We're going with you," said Joe. "Are you? I'm glad," answered the girl, looking at the handsome, earnest face of the young minister. "Your brother's like you for all the world," whispered Mrs. Wentz. "He does look like you," said Kate, with her slow smile. "Which means you think or hope that that is all," retorted Joe, laughingly. "Well, Kate, there the resemblance ends. Thank God for Jim." He spoke in a sad, bitter tone, which caused both women to look at him wonderingly. Joe had to them ever been full of surprises. Never until then had they seen evidences of sadness in his face. A moment's silence ensued. Mrs. Wentz gazed lovingly at the children, who were playing with the trinkets, while Kate mused over the young man's remark, and began studying his half-averted face. She felt warmly drawn to him by the strange expression in the glance he had given his brother. The tenderness in his eyes did not harmonize with much of this wild and reckless boy's behavior. To Kate he had always seemed so bold, so cold, so different from other men, and yet here was proof that Master Joe loved his brother. The murmured conversation of the two ministers was interrupted by a low cry from outside the cabin. A loud, coarse laugh followed, and then a husky voice. "Hold on, my purty lass!" Joe took 2 long strides and was on the doorstep. He saw Nell struggling violently in the grasp of the half-drunken teamster. "I'll just have to kiss this lassie for luck," he said in a tone of good humor. At the same instant Joe saw 3 loungers laughing, and a fourth, a grizzled frontiersman, starting forward with a yell. "Let me go!" cried Nell. Just when the teamster had pulled her close to him, and was bending his red, moist face to hers, 2 brown, sinewy hands grasped his neck with an angry clutch. Deprived thus of breath, his mouth opened, his tongue protruded. His eyes seemed starting from their sockets, and his arms beat the air. Then he was lifted and flung with a crash against the cabin wall. Falling, he lay in a heap on the grass, while the blood flowed from a cut on his temple. "What's this?" cried a man authoritatively. He had come up swiftly, and arrived at the scene where stood the grizzled frontiersman. "It was pretty handy, Wentz. I couldn't have did better myself, and I was coming for that purpose," said the frontiersman. "Leffler was trying to kiss the lass. He's been drunk for 2 days. That little girl's sweetheart can handle himself some, now you take my word on it." "I'll agree he laughs bad when he's drinking," answered the fur trader, and to Joe he added, "He's liable to look you up when he comes around." "Tell him if I'm here when he gets sober I'll kill him," Joe cried in a sharp voice. His gaze rested once more on the fallen teamster, and again an odd contraction of his eyes was noticeable. The glance was cutting, as if with the flash of cold gray steel. "Nell, I'm sorry I wasn't round sooner," he said, apologetically, as if it was owing to his neglect the affair had happened. As they entered the cabin, Nell stole a glance at him. This was the 3rd time he had injured a man because of her. She had on several occasions seen that cold, steely glare in his eyes, and it had always frightened her. It was gone, however, before they were inside the building. He said something which she did not hear distinctly, and his calm voice allayed her excitement. She had been angry with him, but now she realized that her resentment had disappeared. He had spoken so kindly after the outburst. Had he not shown that he considered himself her protector and lover? A strange emotion, sweet and subtle as the taste of wine, thrilled her, while a sense of fear because of his strength was mingled with her pride in it. Any other girl would have been only too glad to have such a champion. She would, too, hereafter, for he was a man of whom to be proud. "Look here, Nell, you haven't spoken to me," Joe cried suddenly, seeming to understand that she had not even heard what he said, so engrossed had she been with her reflections. "Are you mad with me yet?" he continued. "Why, Nell, I love you." Evidently Joe thought such fact a sufficient reason for any act on his part. His tender tone conquered Nell, and she turned to him with flushed cheeks and glad eyes. "I wasn't angry at all," she whispered, and then, eluding the arm he extended, she ran into the other room. End of Chapter 2 of The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.